Now we're on Daf Ayin Aleph Amid Beis, and we're deriving Adam from a Kal Vachomer from Kli Cheres. How so? Adam shematzil al tuma shebetocho milamata. We've already proven from the pasuk that if somebody swallows nevela, then that nevela, once it's swallowed, is inside the body of a person, and it's tuma belua, and therefore it doesn't contaminate anybody, not even the person who swallowed the nevela. Again, if there was no maga. Is therefore we see that the power of an Adam to be matzil from Tuma is greater and supersedes that of the Kli. Because if there's Tuma in the Kli, it's Ola v'yored as Tuma Ritzutza. So we don't have the principle of Tuma Blua in the case of a Kli. But in the case of an Adam, we have Tuma Blua. And therefore the Adam is not Tameh when he has Nevela inside his body that he swallowed. So we see that the power of Hatzalah to prevent the spread of contamination is greater in Adam than it is in a Kli Cheres. Is Eino Din Shematzel Altara Shebetocha Militame. Since we saw that a Kli Cheres, that Samid Pasil, will protect a Tahar object within it from the tomb of the Oel, so at least in the case of Kli Cheres, you have one dimension of Hatzalah to prevent the spread of tumah. Then in the case of Adam, certainly that element is going to apply to an Adam. And therefore, if the Adam has a tar object inside of him, then just like the case of the tar object inside of the Kli Pasil, it's not Makabel Tumah. And this is going to teach us the second principle, which is called Tara Blua Minola. The Gemara doesn't like it. Malik Kli Cheres. There's a certain kula in Kli Cheres, which might justify why Kli Cheres is matzil in a case of tzomid pasil. Shekain ena mitame begaba. Every other case except for Kli Cheres and earthenware, when there's tuma on top, then the tuma is mitame. So let's say, for example, okay, this is happens to be a Kli Cheres, probably. But let's say, for example, if this was not a Kli Cheres, but a Kli Mateches, it was made of metal, then if Tuma touches it on the outside, the exterior, then it becomes Tame. But in the case, that's called Migabo. But in the case of a Kli Cheres, there's no Tuma Migabo. Right? In the case of a Kli Cheres, the Tuma has to go inside. It's like suspended in the air of the Kli Cheres. So therefore, the Torah was makil in the case of Kli Cheres that it's not mitame migabo, and therefore the Torah added another leniency of Kli Cheres shetzomid pasil, that's matzil from the tuma of the Oel, because the Dover Torah is completely closed into the Kli Cheres. But Tomer bi Adam shemitame begabo. I mean, if he has a human being and Tuma comes in contact with this human being, he's Tumah. So Gemara says, I don't get your kash. It doesn't make any sense, your objection. Why? Because Atu Anan Migabo coming, we're not trying to derive conclusions about the case of Migabo, and then you'll say, well, the earthenware Kli has a kula leniency that it's not Mitam Migabo, but Mitocho Kamrina, right? We're only trying to analyze the case of Tuma Blua, meaning where there's a Tahar that's Bolua. That's not a case of Migabo, but rather a case of Mitocho. And Adarabba Kli Cheres Chamur, Shekain Mitame Me'avira. Right? In a Kli Cheres, if you have let's say, a mouse is somehow, with a puppet string, you hang the mouse, the Kli Cheres becomes tummy. That's airspace, right? That's avir. That's a chumrah in klicheres. And yet we find the kula that the klicheres, despite its chumrah, is matzil in a case of samid pasil. How much more so in the case of Adam when he swallows a ring? It's like samid pasil, and it's bolua, and therefore it's not makabel tuma, and that's called matzil. Okay, now we get to a very uh what shall I say? Not a very aesthetic, appealing Gemara. Teina ashkechan bolua mala bolua milamata minalan. What happens? Now, I don't know, Steve, if you ever took a suppository. Did you ever have occasion to do so? Sometimes if you're very, very constipated, in an extreme, or if you have to go for a colonoscopy, I don't even want to think about it. I have so many nightmares about it. There's a certain Kli where I drank this stuff. I still can't look at that Kli. Anyway, so they give you a suppository up the rear. And now what happens if there's something that's tame that was shoved up your rear? That's called balua milamala, but bilamata minolan. How do we know that if a person has a dover tummy that goes up his back, if you know what I mean, that he remains tar? And the Gemara says, Kal v'chomu, mala she'ena osa equal matzil, lamata shose equal eno dinshem matzil. The Gemara says, on the contrary, the fact that it went up the back, then there's equal. Equal means, it becomes disintegrated once it's up the rectum, I guess you'd call it, right? So certainly it makes sense that there should be no contraction of tumor in a case of something that's ma'ukal. Gemara's not happy with that either. Why? Because kluma osa equal milamata el al yidei lamala. In other words, basically the equal, which is kind of a digestive system, is a result of something that goes in the mouth, not something that goes through the rear. There's no digestion on something that comes up through the rear. The Gemara says, equal delamata rav. There's a very substantial digestion, even in something that comes up from the rear. Again, I don't think it's the digestion of the intestines, because that only applies when you chew food through your mouth. But somehow, a minor dimension of digestion can be achieved. And it's definitely swallowed up once it's anyway. Ashkechan bolua de adam bolua de behema minai. What happens if an animal swallows up something tummy? Like, for example, the woman who has a stillborn, a fetus that died. How do you know that the fetus is not tummy because it's balua? That's what we said in our Mishnah, that the mother is not tmeya now, till she has tumas later after the birth, but right now she's not tmeya. Why? Because the fetus is balua, but that's balua behema. How do you know that we can compare behema to adam? And the Gemara says, Kavachon ma adam mitame shemitame michayim. And this is a chumrah in tumas adam. So a man is alive. He comes in contact with a dover amitame, like a corpse, or he goes into the olamis. He becomes tame. That's a chumrah in adam. An animal, as long as it's alive, is not tame. Even if you put, I don't know, put all the shrotzim in the world on top of an animal, it still remains tar. Only an adam becomes tame when he's alive. And nevertheless, matzil bibolua, even though the Torah is more machmir in adam, that as a live being he contracts tumah, whereas a behemoth does not. So you have a chumrah in adam, and yet an adam has a leniency that he does not transfer tumah bibolua. Is behemoth she'ena mitamichayim eno din shetatzil bibolua. The Gemara doesn't like it. Ma le adam shekain sarach shehia v'beis hamenuga. I'm going to show you a leniency in Adam. So now you have a base hamanuga, which means that you found a phenomenon of tzaras on a bias, and the Kohen came and he was mitami the bias. And now a human being enters into the bias, and the question is, what about the clothing that he's wearing? Do they contract tumah? And the halacha is that although if an animal goes into the Beis Hamanuga, let's say he's carrying begodim, he has like a towel or a folded up sheet on top of the animal, so then the tuma of Beis Hamanuga will apply to those begodim. But if a man would, let's say he's wearing, he puts on some sort of protective garment on top of his shoulders, then it's not Makabal Tuma unless he remains within the Beis Hamanuga, Kashir of Achilas Pras. He's Tomar V'Behema. She'ena Tzricha, as soon as the animal goes in, then the contamination is Chal on the Begadim. So we see that the Torah is more Mekil in Adam than a Behema. Once we find one Kula, that's enough for a Pircha the Kavachomer. So Gemara says no. Behema di ena tzricha shehir v'beis hamnugel my hilchasa lekelim shal gava Adam nami lo boy. Just 1 second. The animal is not wearing begodim. So if you want to make a comparison between an Adam and a Behema going into a Beis Hamanuga, you have to have a fair comparison. So you have to talk about a man who's not wearing the begodim, just like an animal is not wearing the begodim. And we have a Mishnah that says in Masechta Negoyim, should probably spend a half a year learning Negoyim, if not a year. Anyway, Hanichnas Beis Hamanuga, the Kalev al Ksefav, Sandola v'tabaosu biyadav. He's not wearing any of his kalim, neither begodim that he wears on his body, nor rings, nor shoes. He's carrying them. Is huvein tmei miyad. It has the same exact din as a behema who's carrying, some sort of begodim on its shoulder. And we don't have to wait, kishias achilas pras. But if a person, a human being who steps into a Beis Hamnug is wearing kalim, or sandola baraglav tabosu betzbo, hu tamim miyad. Vehem tahor machi yishe bichdei achilas pras. Oh, there's a whole discussion here about how long is Kidei Achilas Pras, a half loaf, amount of bread poorly eats at one meal, standard 2 meal feed, use one Erev. All right, so you have to learn Erevin for this. Anyway, a half a loaf, which is Achilas Pras means half, contains 4 egg volumes. Arba Beitzin. Now, wheat bread is eaten more quickly than barley bread. So therefore, when it says here, it says Paschitin velo pasiorin. Is mesa v'yocha b'liftar. All right, it has to be something that you could eat with a lefus. Anyway, what the bottom line is that a person is no less stringent than an animal with regard to contaminations of begodim that he wears on top and carries into a Beis Hamanuga, and therefore the Kal V'chomer is valid. Omar Rav, Travayu Tnaninu. Both of Rabba's principles, namely that Tuma Balua is not Mitame and Tar Balua doesn't become Tame, both of these principles are written in the Mishnah. We don't know why Rabba had to teach me this. He's not discovering America. Tuma Balua, Disnan. Okay, so now we're learning a Mishnah in Mikvos. Bola Tabas Tmeya. So now we have a ring that was makabel to when he swallowed it. Tovel v'ochel b'trumaso, right? He goes into the mikveh, and the ring is still inside of him. He probably needs surgery, maybe laser surgery to remove the ring, but in the meantime, it's inside of him. He didn't vomit it forth. And the halacha is that tovel v'ochel truma. He's tar. How can it be tar if he has a davar tamei inside his body? He's touching it from all sides. But he kia tmei of it. So we see clearly that tuma blua, in the case of a ring that was tamei, is not metame him. So he could go to mikvah and eat truma. And not only that, we have another Mishnah. Oh no, actually it's a sefer the same Mishnah. Tara blua tanina desnan bola tabas tahora. Now we have a case of a tahar ring that he swallowed, and nichnas the olames. He goes into an olames, and what's the status of that tabas? He's of a shana v'toval. In other words, he entered into an olames, and he underwent all the requirements of tahara, right, including hazas, shlishi, v'shvi. Then vihikia harehi kamasha haisa. It's unbelievable. He vomits forth the ring, and the ring is still tar. He himself became tameh. The ring remains tar. Why is that? The answer has to be that tara balua remains tar. So we already have both principles of Rabbah in Mishnayos, right? Actually, in one Mishnah, we'll say in Mikvahos. So what do I need Rabbah for? So Gemara answers, Ki kama Rabbah, what's the chiddush of Rabbah? Ki gon shebola shtei tabos. Okay, now I had a little trouble with this Gemara, but I'm going to try my best. If he swallows two rings, one is tar and one is tummy, they're both together, and they have contact with each other. Achas tmei v'achas tahora. Delo metami lo tmeya l'torah. That for some reason, which Rabbah is going to explain, the tmeya, the ring that's tame, is not metame the ring that's tar, even though they touched each other, they came in contact with each other. And the only reason we can justify that is because the tumah of the ring, of the tame ring, is tumah blua. It was swallowed in his body. Just one second. So why do I need Rabbah for that? Rabbah teaches that the reason for the rulings of the cited Mishnah is in fact that Tumah Blua is precluded from transmitting Tumah and Tara Blua is precluded from acquiring Tumah. It is therefore follows that even when both are together in a person's stomach, one does not contaminate the other. Oh, here's the punchline. Had Rabbah not taught this, we might have thought that the Mishnah's ruling is not based on the principle of Tumah Blua and Tara Blua, but based on a different principle. In which case, the ring that's tame should be metame the ring that's tar. So what is this other principle that we would have had a havmin if not for Rabbah that operates here? That's called maga beis hastorim. The ring is touching inside the stomach, and that's called beis hastorim. So that's a whole nother concept of tumah. That tumah beis hastorim is not tameh. That means through contact in a concealed place. And just to end the shir, I'll just read to you one footnote here. Just give me a second if you don't mind. and then I'll let you go. The law is that when Tuma touches someone in a concealed place, which is called Maga Beis Hastarim, it doesn't contaminate him. And this law applies when the Tuma is not swallowed up, even when the Tuma is not swallowed up. For example, if someone puts nevela on a skewer, he calls it, and then he inserts the skewer into someone's throat, the recipient remains tar, even though it's not swallowed up, because it touched him in a concealed place, right, in deep inside his throat, even though it is not swallowed up. So that would be the Havamina in the case of two rings that were swallowed. One is Tummy, one is Tar. If not for Rabbah, we would have said, well, if it's based on Maga Beis Hastarim, maybe then it wouldn't be Mitame in the cases that are mentioned in the Mishnah in Mikvos. So why would it be Mitame one ring to the other? If a person swallows both a Tame ring and a Tar ring, the Tame one will contaminate the Tar by touching it. Although they are inside a person's body, this is not considered a case of Tumas Beis Hastarim. Why? Because it is as though they are both inside a box. The transmission of Tuma does not involve the person, but the rings themselves, which are unconcealed relative one to the other. So again, if you have the halacha of Tuma Blua, then since the Tame Dika ring is Bolua, it's swallowed up, it cannot be Mitame the Tame, the Tar ring. But if I'm only operating without Rabbah, with the interpretation of Beis Hastarim, then we look at the relationship between the two rings. And in terms of the relationship between the two rings, there's no Beis Hastarim, nothing is concealed. Each ring is looking at the face of the other ring. And that leads us to Gemara's Kasha here on Daf Ayin Beis. Veha ubar vechaya dikishtei tabos tami v'kametame la ubar lechaya. Right, so we had the case of the fetus that died in its mother's body. And now the midwife takes hold of the fetus, and that's like shtei tabos done, which means that the fetus is still inside its mother's womb. It's sort of swallowed up. And therefore, when she extends her hand into the womb and touches the fetus, since the fetus is swallowed up, why should she be tmeah? And that's going to lead us to Machlokas Pshina Baivarov. So Bli Neder, that's what we'll pick up tomorrow at 9:30. Any chance we can make it a little later, like at 10 o'clock? It would be a little easier for me. You let me know.
10 o'clock is fine.
Okay. So, we don't have to get the okay from Usher.
I'll let them know.
Yeah, I think 10 o'clock is a little easier for me because I'm finding that 9:30 is a bit early for me.
All right.
Okay.